Hello and welcome to this special autumn statement live stream on telegraph.co.uk. I'm Samant Bhatia. Well, it's the day when Chancellor George Osborne gives MPs his views on the outlook for the UK economy. In a few minutes, we'll be going back to the House of Commons to watch the speech, and that's due around 12:30 p.m. Meanwhile, joining me to discuss what we can expect from Mr Osborne this afternoon is the Deputy Editor of the Daily Telegraph, Ben Brogan, and Damian Reece, the Head of Business. Thank you both for joining us. Damian, we've always heard that the finances aren't in good shape, but how bad are they really?
Well, they're in terrible shape, and unfortunately they are getting worse. Basically, the deficit's going up. It's going to be up another 10 billion this year at least. Total debt, therefore, is going up. And that means George Osborne is going to miss his fiscal golden rules. So all he can do is announce more cuts, and austerity is going to be pushed out for another, probably to 2018 with another 23 billion pounds of cuts. So all in all, the public finances are out of control and getting worse.
Well, Benedict, given that sort of premise, I suppose, bluntly speaking, there are two things the coalition can do. One is to cut spending, which is very much a Conservative policy, or more of a Lib Dem thing would be to increase taxes. What's happening behind the scenes at the moment?
Well, the first thing you've got to say is who would want to be Chancellor today. I think people often don't appreciate just how difficult it is for anybody running the economy at the moment. The fact is that the situation, as Damian has set out, is really dire and is getting worse. George Osborne has very little room for manoeuvre, but he also faces, in addition to economic constraints, he also faces severe political constraints because he's a Conservative, and if he was running or part of a majority Conservative government, he'd be doing things one way, but he's not. He's part of a coalition, and he has to negotiate everything with the Lib Dems, who, depending on your point of view, if you're a Lib Dem, you are the sound and sane voice of the government, but according to some Tories, the Lib Dems are the sort of drag anchor on what the Conservatives might do. So there's been a lot of negotiation over the last few weeks. Nick Clegg and Danny Alexander for the Lib Dems and David Cameron and George Osborne for the Conservatives have been having lots of meetings where they have haggled and negotiated what they want to do in the autumn statement, and everything George Osborne wants to do, he has to make sure he gets the Lib Dems to agree it, and the things that the Lib Dems want, they have to make sure the Tories agree it. That means there are a lot of things that won't be done because one side or the other doesn't want them. As far as tax and spending is concerned, it's fairly straightforward. George Osborne is keen to cut spending, particularly on welfare, in order to free up some money that he can use elsewhere. The problem is that he also needs to put up taxes, and where he puts up taxes, the Lib Dems have very particular ideas about taxing wealth. So what we'll see today is the outcome of those negotiations.
Damien, what are you expecting then, given that backdrop, particularly in the way of tax rises?
Well, there'll be a lot of fairly footling measures, I suppose. He'll make it look like there's a lot going on, when in fact there's very, very little, as Ben says, he can actually do. But we might see a tweaking to stamp duty, for instance, for higher priced houses, which can be packaged as a bit of a wealth tax. Welfare spending will probably not only go up in terms of the actual benefits by, say, 1% rather than by inflation. And then you might see a whole range of business-related measures on capital allowances and that sort of thing, government guarantees in order to, encourage investment. And he'll talk about infrastructure. The other big thing he's going to talk about, of course, is tax avoidance, and we should get some more information about how the government intends to tackle that particular row.
Benedict, do you think that, I suppose, tax avoidance, as it were, do you think that's more of a political rather than an economic issue? Is it just he has to be seen to be doing something about it?
A lot of it is window dressing. He needs to find money, and he needs to be seen to be targeting those who the public might think are not bearing their fair share. George Osborne has got this line which he's been deploying for some time, that we're all in this together, and one of the things they want to be able to show is that the broader shoulders are carrying some of the burden. And of course there's quite a lot of evidence that there are people and companies out there who perhaps are paying less tax than they might if they were following every page of the tax code. But the fact is, Damian's right, these are fairly footling measures when you take into account not only the vast scale of government spending, the hundreds of billions that the government spends each year, but also the vast amount that it's having to borrow to keep the public finances operating, and the huge, colossal amounts of debt we're accumulating. A billion here, a billion there might sound a lot, but in fact it's fairly small beer. And the truth is that the great forces bearing down on the economy and the absence of growth that George Osborne is grappling with are fairly stubborn and don't necessarily respond very well to a little tweak here and a little tweak there. The danger for George Osborne is that people start noticing that, in fact, for a Chancellor, he is perhaps more powerless than he would like to admit.
Given perhaps that feeling of powerlessness, we have heard that we're going to get more cuts to the civil service, and with that money we're going to see some infrastructure projects. What do you make of that? Is that indeed just a small gesture, or potentially something which could help the economy?
Well, it's aimed at generating £5 billion of extra spending, which is helpful, but not a huge amount. But I think it is laced rather more with political meaning, because it's all about cutting civil servants in order to generate the £5 billion. And I think it's more aimed at playing out to that sort of audience, i.e., yes, we'll increase spending, and we're going to do it by getting rid of all those bureaucrats. So, you know, it's helpful, but it's largely political, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, and of course the autumn statement at one level is quite a political exercise. It's about, there's going to be a lot of political positioning here, not least for George Osborne himself, who took a huge hit to his reputation back in the spring with his budget, which rather exploded in his face because some measures were ill-judged, some were badly presented, some were leaked, and as a result he spent the following 6 months rowing back from quite a few of his positions and having to explain himself. And so his stock among, in particular, his own colleagues on the Conservative benches is quite low at the moment. And so one of the things that George Osborne will be seeking to do with his speech is burnishing his credentials with Conservative backbenchers and trying to reassure them that he is, in fact, the guy to run the economy and does have their confidence. He's trying to regain their confidence. And the fact is that's quite difficult, because there's quite a lot of discomfort on the Conservative sides. They feel that George Osborne could be doing a lot more. He could be cutting spending more vigorously. He should be cutting taxes in order to stimulate the economy, to which George Osborne always replies, well, the fact is I'd love to do all that, but I'm restricted by the Lib Dems. Quite a few Tories think that that excuse is beginning to sound a bit weak, especially as the Lib Dems themselves are very politically weak because they're very low in the polls and have nowhere to go. So a lot of what we're going to see today is about political positioning. And
also, you've written about this, that you think it's a good time for the Conservatives to sort of distance themselves from what Labour's saying. It's a chance for them to get their message across, with an election potentially, you know, only a few years away.
Yeah. The fact is that we are, strangely today, we're at the halfway point of the Parliament. And the fact is that the way Westminster works, it may be a very Westminster preoccupation, but we are going to start thinking about the next general election, which is in May 2015. And the Conservatives need to start thinking about how they're going to present themselves and what kind of story they're going to tell to the voters to try to persuade the voters to give them the majority that they failed to win in 2010. And for them to do that, they need to sound more Conservative. But the difficulty is that George Osborne had hoped that his story for the election would be one of success, that he would have by now started sorting out the deficit, he would have closed and got rid of the deficit by 2015 and might even have a bit of spare cash to give away in tax cuts. None of that's going to happen. So what the Tories need to find is a different story to tell, and it's going to be quite a difficult one to sell to the voters, because it's going to be stick with us for fear of getting something worse in the shape of Ed Miliband. That's perhaps not as exciting as what they had hoped to offer the voters.
Also, I guess there's some blame, well, a lot of blame put on the Eurozone's problems. Do you think that's a fair summation, that the Conservatives can say that?
Well, other factors do play a part, and it does go and explain to a certain extent why tax revenues, for instance, are much weaker than expected, which is one of the fundamental problems that Osborne, unfortunately, has got. So, yes, the Eurozone, our biggest trading partner, is not trading very much. So exports are down. Economic growth is therefore hit. Likewise, in the Far East, although they're still growing rather more slowly than we thought they were. So this is a statement where also Osborne, I think, needs to re-establish his reputation for being competent, and in that respect, I think he needs to show that he's not doing any harm. As Ben says, the March budget was laced with mistakes, and his reputation took a real dent. He can rebuild this by not doing any harm.
So basically being boring, if we're being honest.
There's a bit of that. And also the other thing that he has to worry about is that the thing that he trades on the most, the thing that really is keeping him afloat, is the fact that the markets continue to have confidence in UK PLCs. So the cost of borrowing in this country is actually remarkably low. And that benefits all of us, not just, and in particular, the government, because it keeps the cost of government borrowing low. But the fact is that that is a fragile quality. And George Osborne is very conscious of the fact that anything the government does will be judged by the markets. And so I think what he doesn't want to do is anything that will startle the markets and make them revise their benign view of the British government's approach to the economy. And so I suspect that he will avoid anything too flash and anything too surprising in his autumn statement, because markets don't like surprises and they don't like things they didn't anticipate. The basic story he's got to tell is steady as she goes. We've made progress, but there's a lot more to do. And so therefore, whatever he says today, I suspect that he will be minded to avoid anything that looks a bit too sharp, a bit too clever, because the markets might think that's not quite what we want to hear from an economy that is in such a perilous state.
Damian, with that in mind then, let's say, I mean, the danger which we always hear about is that we could lose our AAA status with the credit rating agencies. Is that a big deal? We've seen America lose its AAA status, we've seen France lose its AAA status, or is it something that we should jealously guard here as a nation?
It is a big deal for us because we obviously have our own independent currency. The Americans is the world's reserve currency, the dollar, so it didn't really affect them very much. And France is part of the euro, which is subject to all sorts of other issues and is still a huge currency. For the pound, the little old pound, it would be a problem. And if, as we expect, he's going to miss one of his two main fiscal targets, his golden rules, then that will increase the chance of the AAA rating going. And once the market gets a sniff of it, yields will start to go up and it becomes a self-perpetuating prophecy, as it were. So it looks like it will probably go at some point next year, just as Mark Carney is coming in as the new governor of the Bank of England.
I think we're all agreed then that it's the worst position. I mean, no one would want to be George Osborne today.
Exactly. I think it's an impossible task, but the fact is he's got to get up in a few minutes and make that speech, so he has to come up with something. So there'll be a few things to please the crowd and a lot of things designed to calm his backbenchers, but I suspect what we'll get is a lot of steady as she goes.
Well, we're going to go back very soon now to the Houses of Parliament and to that autumn statement. But just to remind you, you're watching a live stream of the autumn statement here on telegraph.co.uk. I believe we've got a little bit of extra time, so I'm going to put you both on the spot, though, and ask you what would be your measure if you were taking that horrible position of being the Chancellor? What would you like to see, which perhaps he won't mention today?
I would like him to see to do more for business and to do more on the supply side. I think he has not done nearly enough to advance the case for getting rid of regulation and for stimulating investment for business, and that, I think, is what we'd like to hear.
Yes, as a politician, you're in the business of winning votes, and if you're going to win votes, you need jobs. And if you're going to generate jobs, I think the obvious thing to do would be to introduce a national insurance holiday for employers for 6 or 12 months.
And the other thing, of course, we need to think is he's got in mind is the whole question of fuel costs. He's under a lot of pressure, particularly from his MPs, who are getting a lot of pressure themselves from their constituents, that the cost of driving your car is just way too high. So there is a lot of talk of him announcing some kind of longer-term deferral of the duty increase in petrol. There was some speculation that he might defer it right the way back to 2015 and the next election. I suspect that he quite enjoys those moments once or twice a year where he can stand up and say, I've decided not to go ahead with the rise in fuel duty. So I suspect he will reserve the right to do that every year. But I suspect that George Osborne will be announcing that there won't be any duty rises, certainly in the medium term.
You sort of alluded to it earlier that the backbenchers aren't totally happy with George Osborne. Where do we stand at the moment in the feeling with George Osborne and I suppose David Cameron at the moment? This difficult tightrope, are they walking it correctly at the moment, do you feel?
The difficulty, I think, for David Cameron and George Osborne is that there are quite a few Conservative MPs who can't stand them and who would quite happily see them fail, quite happily see them fall flat on their faces. And the reason for that goes back into the mists of time. There are quite a few MPs who felt they were snubbed by these two young politicians on the make when they were just backbenchers. And today, though, what's interesting is the development is that there are quite a few cabinet ministers who feel quite aggrieved because they feel that they are bullied and pushed around a bit too much by George Osborne and by David Cameron around the cabinet table. That's particularly aimed at the Chancellor, who can be quite high-handed, they say. And so what's interesting is that George Osborne, rather than making friends, seems to be acquiring enemies. That's not a good position to be in as a Chancellor. I suspect people are prepared to put up with an unpopular Chancellor who's a bit tough with people and treats them badly, as long as he's successful. So if he wants to carry on being high-handed with his colleagues, I think he's going to have to start demonstrating success on the economic field. And we haven't seen enough of that yet.
You'd have thought, though, that any Conservative government would get a little bit of help from business, but even the CBI and the IOD haven't been totally behind what George Osborne's trying to do.
Well, they were at the beginning, but they've become very, very frustrated very quickly because they really don't see the supply side reforms that Ben mentioned earlier coming through anywhere near quickly enough, and it's baffling to them as to why that is, because some of these things can be done without really affecting the fiscal balance in the economy short term, because they are long-term measures, or their effects are long-term, but at least it gets things going and they get the direction of travel established for business, which is important for confidence. But they're just not seeing some of those reforms, like on planning, for instance, to get the infrastructure programme underway. And there's a lot of dithering in terms of what the government will do in terms of underpinning the finances of these things. So they are getting increasingly frustrated, and of course they realise that the business cycle is completely out of touch with the political cycle.
Well, thanks once again for joining us, Ben and Damian. We're going to go live now to the comments and just hear what George Osborne's going to say and how he's going to square a massive circle, as it were.
At home and abroad. At home we live with the decade of debt and the failure to equip Britain to compete in the modern world. And we face a multitude of problems from abroad. The US fiscal cliff, the slowing growth in China, above all the Eurozone now in recession. People know that there are no quick fixes to these problems, but they want to know that we are making progress. And the message from today's autumn statement is that we are making progress. It is a hard road, but we're getting there. And Britain is on the right track.
Ask the Chancellor to resume his seat. Now look, let's be clear about this. Each side should be heard with courtesy. The House knows well enough by now that I will afford a very full opportunity for questioning of the Chancellor. But the more interruption, the greater the noise, the longer the session will take, and that cannot be right. So I appeal to members, please, to give the Chancellor a courteous hearing, as indeed, if it becomes necessary, I will appeal to government backbenchers to afford a fair hearing to the Shadow Chancellor. That's how it should be. The Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, Britain is on the right track, and turning back now would be a disaster. We have much more to do. The deficit has fallen by a quarter in just 2 years, and today's figures show it is forecast to continue to fall. Exports of goods to the major emerging economies, which were pitifully low, have doubled since 2009. And since this coalition government came to office, 1.2 million new jobs have been created in the private sector. In a world economy where bond investors are fleeing countries they regard as risky, investment is flowing into UK gilts instead of flying from them. And we have to keep it that way. 2 years ago, Britain was in the danger zone. Now we are seen as one of the safe havens, able to borrow money at lower interest rates than at any time in our history. And today's forecast shows a £33 billion saving on the debt interest payments it was predicted we would have to pay 2 years ago. That is as much as the entire defence budget, which is why in this autumn statement, we show that this coalition government is confronting the country's problems instead of ducking them. Today, we reaffirm our commitment to reducing the deficit, setting out the details of our spending plans for 2015-16, and rolling forward an outline framework into 2017-18. We show our determination to do this fairly, with further savings from bureaucracy, from the benefits bill and from the better off. We go on equipping Britain to succeed in the global race by switching from current spending to capital investment in science, roads and education. We offer new support for business and enterprise so they can create the jobs we need. And in everything we do, we will show today we are on the side of those who want to work hard and get on. Mr. Speaker, the Office for Budget Responsibility has today produced its latest economic forecast, and it is a measure of the constitutional achievement that it is taken for granted that our country's forecast is now produced independently of the Treasury, free from the political interference of the past. I want to thank Robert Choate, his fellow members of the Budget Responsibility Committee, Steve Nicol and Graham Parker, and all their staff, at the OBR for their rigorous approach. One of the advantages of the creation of the OBR is that not only do we get independent forecasts, we also get an independent explanation of why the forecasts are as they are. If, for example, lower growth was the result of government's fiscal policy, they would say so. But they do not. They say the economy has performed less strongly than expected. They forecast growth this year of -0.1%. But in their view, and these are their words, the weaker than expected growth can be more than accounted for by over-optimism regarding net trade, because the OBR had previously assumed that the Eurozone would begin to recover in the second half of this year. Instead, of course, it has continued to contract, and that has hit our exports to these markets and the net trade numbers. The Eurozone crisis has also, the OBR say, spilled over into tighter credit conditions and elevated UK bank funding costs, and in the OBR's words, these problems will constrain growth for several years to come. There are domestic problems too that they refer to. In the report today, the contraction in 2008-2009 is now assessed to be deeper than previously thought, with GDP shrinking by a staggering 6.3%, the largest shock to our economy since the Second World War. In the OBR's view, the aftermath of this shock continues to weigh on the productivity of the UK economy, with credit rationing and impaired financial markets potentially impeding the expansion of successful firms. They say that GDP growth is now expected to be lower in every year of the forecast period as credit conditions take longer to normalise and global growth remains, in their words, weaker than previously expected. As a result, the OBR forecasts that the economy will grow by 1.2% next year, then 2% in 2014, 2.3% in 2015, 2.7% in 2016 and 2.8% in 2017. So the economy is recovering, and it's recovering more quickly than many of our neighbours. The IMF estimates that the UK next year will grow more strongly than either France or Germany. And our credible fiscal policy allows for supportive monetary policy, and with the Bank of England we are directly addressing the problems of tight credit through the £70 billion funding for lending scheme. In the OBR's view today, this has reduced UK bank funding costs, lowered interest rates in the real economy, and will add to the level of real GDP. One area where the British economy has done much better than forecast is in creating jobs. Since early 2010, the private sector has created 1.2 million new jobs, 600,000 more than was predicted, and youth unemployment has been falling. Instead of peaking at 8.7%, the OBR now expects unemployment to peak at 8.3%. This at a time when the unemployment rate in Spain is 26%, in France it is almost 11%, and across the whole Eurozone it is almost 12%. Employment, already at a record high, is set to go on rising each year of the forecast, and for every one job less in the public sector, 2 new jobs are expected to be created in the private sector. Britain now has a greater proportion of its people in work than either the Eurozone or the United States of America. Mr. Speaker, more jobs means that the impact of the weaker than forecast GDP on the public finances has been less than some might have expected. There have been 3 developments that have each had a significant one-off impact on the public finances, and in the report today we publish clearly and transparently the impact of all 3. First, there is the transfer of the Royal Mail Pension Fund to the public sector as part of its privatisation. This produces a one-off reduction in the deficit of £28 billion this year, but it adds to the deficit in the years afterwards. Second, the previous government had classified Bradford and Bingley and Northern Rock Asset Management as off-balance sheet. Today it is brought on balance sheet in line with the judgment of the Office for National Statistics. This adds around £70 billion to our national debt and reminds us of the price the country is still paying for the failures of the past. Third, the government has decided Third, the government has decided, with the agreement of the Bank of England, to transfer excess cash held in the asset purchase facility to the Exchequer. This is sensible cash management. It is in line with the approach of the Bank of Japan and the US Federal Reserve. I welcome the OBR's verdict that this is, in their words, more transparent than the previous approach. I want to make sure its impact on the figures is also completely transparent, so we have today published the forecasts for the public finances with and without the impact of the APF decision. Mr. Speaker, when we came to office, the deficit stood at 11.2%, the highest in our peacetime history. It was forecast to be the largest of any major economy in the world. In the last 2 years, the deficit has fallen by a quarter. Today's figures show that with or without the APF coupons, the deficit is forecast to fall this year as well. And cash borrowing is forecast to fall too. Last year, the deficit was 7.9%. This year, with the APF coupons, it is forecast to be 6.9%, but that excludes the impact of the Royal Mail pension assets. It is falling, and it will continue to fall each and every year to 6.1% next year, 5.2% the year after, 4.2% in 2015-16, then 2.6% before reaching 1.6% in 2017-18. In 2009-10, the country was borrowing £159 billion. This year, we are borrowing £108 billion. That is forecast to fall to £99 billion next year, £88 billion the year after, then £73 billion in 2015-16, and £49 billion and £31 billion in the 2 years after that. These are the central forecasts published by the OPR, with the asset purchase facility cash transfer included. When the transfer is excluded, as we show in the document, the deficit also falls from 7.9% last year to 7.7% this year, then 6.9% next year, and falls in every single year after that. And cash borrowing falls in every year as well. Now, there are those who have been saying that the deficit was going up this year. Indeed, I think I heard it in Prime Minister's questions. But any way you present these figures, this is not what the OBR forecasts show today. They say that the deficit is coming down this year and every year of this Parliament. Yes, the deficit is still far too high for comfort. We cannot relax our efforts to make our economy safe. But Britain is heading in the right direction. The road is hard, but we are making progress. Mr. Speaker, unlike the previous government's golden rule, the regime we have set up means that the Chancellor is no longer judge and jury of their own fiscal rules. And today, the OBR have assessed us against those rules. First, the fiscal mandate. This is the commitment that we will balance the cyclically adjusted current budget over the coming 5 years. I can tell the House that the OBR have assessed that we are, in their words, on course to meet our fiscal mandate. In other words, we have a better than 50% chance of eliminating the structural current deficit in 5 years' time, that part of our borrowing that doesn't recover automatically as the economy grows. Now, this is true, again, with or without the transfer of the coupons. So we will meet our fiscal mandate. But the OBR assess in their central forecast that we do not meet the supplementary objective that aims to have debt falling by 2015-16. The point at which debt starts to fall has been delayed by 1 year to 2016-17. And the OBR's central forecast is that net debt will be 74.7% this year, then 76.8% next year, 79% in 2014-15, 79.9% in 2015-16, before falling to 79.2% in 2016-17 and 77.3% in 2017-18. In short, the tougher economic conditions mean that while our deficit is forecast to go on falling, instead of taking 3 years to get our debt falling, it's going to take 4. Now, Mr. Speaker, confronted with this news, some say we should abandon our deficit plan and try to borrow more. They think by borrowing more, we can borrow less. That would risk higher interest rates, more debt interest payments and a complete loss of Britain's fiscal credibility. We are not taking that road to ruin. Now, then there are those who say that despite all that has happened in the world this year, we should cut even more now to hit the debt target. That would require £17 billion of extra cuts a year, and let me explain why I've decided not to take this course. We've always argued we should let the automatic stabilisers work. We have not argued we should chase down a cyclical or temporary deterioration in the economy, particularly one which our own independent body says is largely driven by problems abroad. That is also the judgment of the IMF, the OECD and the Governor of the Bank of England. Our aim is to reduce the structural deficit, the permanent hole in our public finances that won't be repaired as the economy recovers. And we are. We've cut the structural deficit by 3 percentage points in the last 2 years, more than any other G7 country, and it is set to go on being cut at a similar rate in the years ahead. This lower deficit is delivered by our public spending plans, and we are going to stick with those plans. Overall, we are not going faster or slower with those plans. The measures I will announce in this autumn statement are fiscally neutral across this Parliament. And there is no net rise in taxes today. Any taxes increased are offset by taxes cut. Mr. Speaker, in last year's autumn statement, we committed the government to maintain the same pace of consolidation for 2 further years beyond the end of the current spending review into 2015 and 2016-17. In this year's autumn statement, we extend the consolidation for 1 further year into 2017-18. The OBR projects that as a result, the share of national income spent by the state will fall from almost 48% of GDP in 2009-10 to 39.5% by 2017-18. The document shows total managed expenditure will continue to fall and will now be 4.6 billion lower in 2017-18 than if it had been held flat in real terms. No decision to cut spending is ever easy, but those who object must explain whether instead they would have higher taxes or higher borrowing or both. I also provide further detail of the consolidation plans for 2015-16, the last year of this Parliament. I said 2 years ago that the correct balance for our fiscal consolidation between spending and tax should be 80-20. I can confirm that by the end of 2015-16, the decisions we announced today mean we will almost exactly deliver on that 80-20 mix. Total spending will fall in that final year of this Parliament at the same rate as through the current spending review. I can confirm today that the overall envelope for total managed expenditure will be set at £745 billion. We start with the working assumption that departmental resource totals will continue on the same trajectory as over the current spending review. The detail of departmental spending plans for 2015-16 will be set at a spending review which will be announced during the first half of next year. What we do today is to take steps now to help deliver those spending plans and to go on reducing the deficit in a way that is fair. This government has shown that it is possible to restore sanity to the public finances while improving the quality of our public services. Crime has fallen. Hospital waiting lists are down. School standards are up. And this is with a civil service that is today smaller than at any time since the Second World War. We are today publishing the reports we commissioned from the pay review bodies on market-facing pay. We commit to implement these reports. This means continuing with national pay arrangements in the NHS and prison service, and we will not make changes to the civil service arrangements either. But the school teachers review body does recommend much greater freedom to individual schools to set pay in line with performance. And my right honourable friend, the Education Secretary, will set out how this will be implemented. Through the efforts of individual government departments and the support of the Chief Secretary and my right honourable friend, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, we have already generated £12 billion of efficiency savings in Whitehall. But we believe there is room to do even more. If all departments reduce their spending on administration in line with the best performing departments like education and communities and local government, then another £1 billion could be saved. If all departments made greater provision of digital services, rationalised their property estates, as some have done, then a further £1 billion could be saved. So today we are reducing departmental resource budgets by 1% next year and 2% in the year after. We will continue to seek efficiency savings in the NHS and in our schools, but that money will be recycled to protect spending in these priority areas. Local government budgets are already being held down next year to deliver the freeze in council tax, so we will not seek the additional 1% saving next year, but we will look for the 2% saving the year after. And while the Ministry of Defence is included in these measures, they will be given flexibility on their multi-year budget to ensure that this will not lead to reductions in military manpower or the core defence equipment programme over the Parliament. A mark of our values as a society is our commitment to the world's poorest. We made a promise as a country that we would spend 0.7% of our gross national income on international development, and I am proud to be part of the first British government in history which will honour that commitment and honour it as promised next year. We will not, however, spend more than 0.7%. So, as we did last year, we will adjust the DFID budget to reflect the latest economic forecasts. In the medium term, these savings across Whitehall will help departments maintain the right trajectory for the years that follow the spending review and help us to pay off the deficit in the future. In the short term, I'm switching these current savings into capital. All the money saved in the first 2 years will be reinvested as part of a £5 billion capital investment in the infrastructure of our country. So despite, Mr. Speaker, the fiscal challenges we face, public investment as a share of GDP will be higher on average in this Parliament than it was under the last Labour government. It is exactly what a government equipping Britain to compete in the modern global economy should be doing. We're committing an extra £1 billion to roads, including 4 major new schemes, to upgrade key sections of the A1, bringing the route from London to Newcastle up to motorway standard, linking the A5 with the M1, dualling the A30 in Cornwall, and upgrading the M25, which will support the biggest port development in Europe. And I pay tribute to my honourable friend for Thurrock for the campaigning she's undertaken to achieve this. We've already set our plans this autumn for a huge investment in rail, and my honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, will set out in the new year plans to take High Speed 2 to the North West and to West Yorkshire. I can today confirm a £1 billion loan and a guarantee to extend the Northern Line to Battersea Power Station and support a new development on a similar scale to the Olympic Park. We're confirming funding and reforms to assist the construction of up to 120,000 new homes and delivering on flood defence schemes in more cities. On top of broadband expansion for our countryside and our larger cities, we're funding ultra-fast broadband in 12 smaller cities. These are Brighton and Hove, Cambridge, Coventry, Derby, Oxford, Portsmouth, Salford, York, Newport, Aberdeen, Perth and Derry, Londonderry. In addition to the third of £1 billion announced this autumn for British science, we are today announcing £600 million more for the UK's scientific research infrastructure. And since improving our education system is the best investment in a competitive economy, I am today committing £270 million to fund improvements in further education colleges and £1 billion to expand good schools and build 100 new free schools and academies. Mr. Speaker, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland will get their Barnett share of additional capital spending put at their disposal of their devolved administrations. On top of this £5 billion of new capital spending in infrastructure and support for business, we are ready to provide guarantees for up to £40 billion more. Today I can announce that projects worth £10 billion have already pre-qualified. We're offering £10 billion worth of guarantees for housing too. Our country's pension funds will launch their new independent infrastructure investment platform next year as well. and we have today published full details of the replacement for the discredited PFI. Since we can all see now that the public sector was sharing the risk, we will now ensure we also share in the reward. And I commend my honourable friend for Hereford for his work in this area. Taken together, this is a revolution in the sources of finance for upgrading Britain's infrastructure and equipping Britain to win in the global race. Annual average infrastructure investment, which was £29 billion under the last Labour government, is now £33 billion. Now, savings from Whitehall are not enough by themselves to tackle our debts. We need to find other savings, and we need to do it in a way that is fair. Those with the most should contribute the most, and they will. But fairness is also about being fair to the person who leaves home every morning to go out to work and sees their neighbour still asleep living a life on benefits. As well as a tax system where the richest pay their fair share, we have to have a welfare system that is fair to the working people who pay for it. Mr. Speaker, let me start with tax. The vast majority of people, rich or otherwise, pay their taxes and make their contribution. But there are still too many who illegally evade their taxes or use aggressive tax avoidance in order not to pay their fair share. This government has taken more action against these people than any before it. Prosecutions for tax evasion are up 80%. We will collect £7 billion more a year in tax that is due than the last government. We are increasing by around 2,500 the number of tax inspectors going after evaders and avoiders. And next year we will introduce the first ever general anti-abuse rule, something that never happened in 13 years before we came to office. And next year, for the first time in our history, money will be flowing from bank accounts in Switzerland to Britain instead of the other way round. Because of the treaty we've signed, we expect to receive £5 billion over the next 6 years from the undisclosed Swiss bank accounts of UK residents. It is the largest tax evasion settlement in British history. And we're taking further steps today. Hundreds of millions of pounds of tax loopholes are being closed with immediate effect, and we are investigating abusive use of partnerships. HMRC will not have its budget cut over the next 2 years, unlike other departments. Instead, we will spend £77 million more on fighting tax avoidance, and not just for wealthy individuals. We want the most competitive corporate tax system of any major economy in the world, but we expect those corporate taxes to be paid. So today we're confirming that we will put more resources into ensuring multinational companies pay their proper share of taxes, and we are leading the international efforts to prevent artificial transfers of profits to tax havens. With Germany and now France, we have asked the OECD to take this work forward, and we will make it an important priority of our G8 presidency next year. In total, we expect the action we announced today will increase the amount of money collected from tax evasion and avoidance by a further £2 billion a year. Fair and necessary as this is, it is not enough by itself to close the deficit. We need to ask more from the better off. Punitive tax rates do nothing to raise money and simply discourage enterprise and investment in Britain. Other countries on our doorstep are trying that approach and are paying the price, and we're not going to make that mistake. HMRC data reveals that in the first year of the 50% tax rate, tax revenues from the rich fell by £7 billion, and the number of people declaring incomes of over £1 million fell by a half. A tax rate on the rich that raises almost no money is a tax con. We're going to have a top rate of tax that supports enterprise, and we're going to raise more money from the rich. Here is a simple fact. The richest will pay a greater share of income tax revenues in every single year of this coalition government than in any one of the 13 years of the last Labour government. But we need to make sure the deficit reduction remains fair. We need to raise more. Now, we've already, Mr. Speaker, We've already raised stamp duty on multi-million-pound homes and next week published the legislation to stop the richest avoiding stamp duty. But we won't introduce a new tax on property. This would require a revaluation of hundreds of thousands of homes. In my view, it would be intrusive, expensive to levy, raise little, and the temptation for future chancellors to bring ever more homes into its net would be irresistible, so we're not having a new homes tax. We have in this Parliament already reduced the amount of tax relief we give to the very largest pension pots. From 2014-15, I will further reduce the lifetime allowance from £1.5 million to £1.25 million and reduce the annual allowance from £50,000 to £40,000. This will reduce the cost of tax relief to the public purse by an extra £1 billion a year by 2016-17. 98% of people currently approaching retirement have a pension pot worth less than £1.25 million. Indeed, the median pot for such people is just £55,000. 99% of pension savers make annual contributions to their pensions of less than £40,000. The average contribution to a pension is just £6,000 a year. Now, I know these tax measures will not be welcomed by all. Ways to reduce the deficit never are. But we must demonstrate that we're all in this together, and when you look for savings, I think it's fair to look at the tax relief we give to the top 1%. Mr. Speaker, I want to help the great majority of savers. That's why we're introducing a generous new single-tier pension, so that people know it always pays to save. That's why I will uprate next April the overall ISA limit to £11,520. And we will consult on allowing investment in SME equity markets like AIM to be held directly in stocks and shares ISAs to encourage investment in growing businesses. I've also listened to concerns from pensioners about drawdown limits. I am today announcing that the government will raise the capped drawdown limit from 100% to 120%, giving pensioners with these arrangements the option of increasing their incomes. Mr. Speaker, it's also fair to look at the way we uprate benefits and some tax thresholds. The basic state pension has this year gone up by the largest cash amount in its history. Next year, thanks to our triple lock, I confirm it will rise by 2.5%, higher than either earnings or inflation. That takes the level of the basic state pension to £110.15 a week. When it comes to working age welfare, we've already made substantial reforms. £18 billion a year has been cut from the welfare bill. Benefits are being capped for the first time, so families out of work will not get more than the average family gets for being in work. We've increased efforts to fight welfare fraud. Today we announce further measures and cheques to save over £1 billion in the next 4 years by reducing fraud, error and debt in the tax credit system. Next year, my right honourable friend, the Work and Pension Secretary, will introduce the new universal credit so that it always pays to work. And today we set the key parameters, such as the levels of earnings disregards. But we have to acknowledge that over the last 5 years, those on out-of-work benefits have seen their incomes rise twice as fast as those in work. With pay restraint in businesses and government, average earnings have risen by around 10% since 2007. Out-of-work benefits have gone up by around 20%. That's not fair to working people who pay the taxes that fund them. Those working in the public services who have seen their basic pay frozen will now see it rise by an average of 1%. And a similar approach of a 1% rise should apply to those in receipt of benefits. That's fair, and it will ensure that we have a welfare system that Britain can afford. We will support the vulnerable, so carers' benefits and disability benefits, including disability elements of tax credits, will be increased in line with inflation, and we're extending support for mortgage interest for 2 more years. But most working age benefits, including job seekers allowance, employment and support allowance and income support, will be uprated by 1% for the next 3 years. We will also uprate elements of the child tax credit and the working tax credits by 1% for the next 3 years, although previously planned freezes will go ahead. Local housing allowance rates that are a central component of housing benefit will be uprated in line with the existing policy next April, and then we will cap increases at 1% in the 2 years after that. For this measure, 30% of the savings will be used to exempt from the new cap those areas with the highest rent increases. The earning disregard for universal credit will also be uprated by 1% for 2 years from April 2014. Child benefit is currently frozen. It too will now rise by 1% for 2 years from April 2014. Let me be clear, uprating benefits at 1% means people get more cash but less than the rate of inflation. And taken together, we will save £3.7 billion in 2015-16 and deliver permanent savings each and every year from our country's welfare bill. To bring all these decisions for many benefits over many years together, we will introduce into Parliament primary legislation, the Welfare Uprating Bill, and I hope it commands support from both sides of the House. Now, Mr. Speaker, we will apply a similar approach to the uprating of some of our tax thresholds as we have to welfare. The higher rate threshold will be increased by 1% in the tax years 2014-15 and 2015-16. So the income at which people start paying the 40% rate will go up from £41,450 to £41,865 and then to £42,285. I want to be completely clear with people. This is an increase. In fact, it's the first cash increase in the higher rate threshold in this Parliament, but it is not an increase in line with inflation, and so it raises £1 billion of revenue by 2015-16. Again, there are no easy ways to reduce the deficit, but from year to year, no one will pay a penny more in income tax. In the same way, the capital gains tax annual exempt amount will be increased by 1% over the same period, reaching £11,100, and the inheritance tax nil band rate, which has been frozen since 2009 at £325,000, will be increased by 1% in 2015-16 to £329,000. Taken with the welfare uprating decisions, this is a fair approach to paying off Britain's debts. But dealing with those debts is only one part of making Britain fit to compete in the global race. Countries like ours risk being outsmarted, outworked and outcompeted by new emerging economies. We asked Michael Heseltine to report on how to make the government work better for business and enterprise. I think it's fair to say that his answer has captured the imagination of all political parties. We will respond formally in the spring, but here's what we will do now. First, government spending should be aligned with the priorities of the local business community. We will provide new money to support the local enterprise partnerships, and from April 2015, the government will place more of the funding that currently goes to local transport, housing, skills, and getting people back to work into a single pot that LEPs can bid for. Details will be set out in the spending review. Before then, we are putting more money into the Regional Growth Fund, which is helping businesses create 500,000 new jobs. Second, as Lord Heseltine also recommends, we're going to support industries and technologies where Britain has a clear advantage. With my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary's support, we will extend our global lead in aerospace and support the supply chains of advanced manufacturing. We're also taking big steps today to support British companies who export to new emerging markets in Asia, Africa and the Americas. I am increasing the funding for UKTI by over 25% a year so that it can help more firms build the capacity of overseas British chambers and maintain our country's position as the #1 destination in Europe for foreign investment. And we are launching a new £1.5 billion export finance facility to support the purchase of British exports. Third, we are addressing the credit problems for companies. We're creating a new business bank, and today we confirm we're providing it with £1 billion of extra capital, which will lever in private lending to help small and medium-sized firms and bring together existing schemes. And fourth, we are going to cut business taxes still further. Let me tell you how. The temporary doubling of the small business rate relief scheme helps over 500,000 small firms, with 350,000 firms paying no rates at all. The last government were going to end it in September 2011. We've already extended it to next April, and today I extend it by a further year to April 2014. We also today confirm the tax relief for our employee shareholder scheme. The energy bill provides certainty and support for billions of pounds of investment in renewable energy. Today we publish our gas strategy to ensure we make the best use of lower cost gas power, including new sources of gas under the land. We are consulting on new tax incentives for shale gas and announcing the creation of a single office so that regulation is safe but simple. We don't want British families and businesses to be left behind as gas prices tumble on the other side of the Atlantic. We're going to help our construction industry too. The last government abolished empty property relief, and as excellent work done by my honourable friends, the members for York Outer and Wolverhampton South West and others show, this has blighted development in our towns and cities. The proposal from my colleagues that we create a long grace period before newly completed buildings have to pay empty property rates is a sensible one, and we will introduce it next October. The previous government also planned to increase the small companies' tax rate to 22%, and we have cut it to 20%. But I'd like to help small and medium-sized firms more, and I want to thank my honourable friends for Burnley and for Pendle for their thoughts in this area. Starting on the 1st of January, and for the next 2 years, I am therefore going to increase by tenfold the annual investment allowance in plant and machinery. Instead of £25,000 worth of investment being eligible for 100% relief, £250,000 worth investment will now qualify. This capital allowance will cover the total annual investment undertaken by 99% of all the business in Britain. It's a huge boost to all those who run a business, who aspire to grow and expand and create jobs. Mr. Speaker, I also want Britain to have the most competitive business tax regime of any major economy in the world. I have already cut the main core rate of corporation tax from 28% to 24%, and it's set to fall further to 22%. This has helped British companies and, frankly, left other countries scrambling to keep up. They will have to try harder, for I am today cutting the main rate of corporation tax again by a further 1%. In America, the rate is 40%. In France, it is 33%. In Germany, it is 29%. From April 2014, the corporation tax rate in Britain will stand at 21%. This is the lowest rate of any major Western economy. It is an advert for our country that says, come here, invest here, create jobs here. Britain is open for business. Mr. Speaker, we will not pass the benefit of this reduced rate on to banks, and to ensure that we meet our revenue commitments, the bank levy rate will be increased to 0.130% next year. Making banks contribute more is part of our major reforms to the banking system. We also have to be on the side of those who want to work hard and get on. I know how difficult many families have found the cost of living. In dealing with the deficit, we've had to save money, but whenever we've been able to help, we have. We've helped councils freeze council tax for 2 years running, and we're helping them to freeze it again next year. We put a cap on rail fare rises for the next 2 years, so commuters are not punished for travelling to work. We're forcing energy companies to move families onto the lowest tariffs for their gas and electricity bills. And we've helped motorists with the cost of petrol. We've cancelled the last government's escalator, and I'm moving inflation-only rises to September. Fuel is 10 pence per litre cheaper than it would have been if we'd stuck to Labour's tax plans. And I want to keep it that way, as I know to my colleagues like my honourable friend for Harlow. There is a 3 pence per litre rise planned for this January. Now, some have suggested that we delay that 3 pence rise until April. I disagree. I suggest we cancel it altogether. There will be no 3 pence fuel tax rise this January. That is real help with the cost of living for families as they fill up their cars across the country. And it will help businesses too. And it means that under this government, we'll have had no increases in petrol taxes for nearly 2.5 years. In fact, they've been cut. Mr. Speaker, we've also helped working people by increasing the amount they can earn before paying any income tax. When this coalition government came to office, the personal tax allowance stood at just £6,475. Next April, it is set to rise to £9,205. 24 million taxpayers have seen their income tax cut. 2 million of the lowest paid have been taken out of tax altogether. And because of the difficult decisions we've taken today, we can go even further. From next April, the personal allowance will rise by a further £235. That means a total increase next year of £1,335, the highest cash increase ever. People will be able to earn £9,440 before paying any income tax at all. This is a direct boost to the incomes of people working hard to provide for their families. It's £47 extra in cash next year. In total, a £267 cash increase next year. People working full-time on the minimum wage will have seen their income tax bill cut in half. And we are within touching distance of the £10,000 personal allowance. And at this time, I propose to extend the benefits of this further increase to higher rate taxpayers. That decision will stand alongside the decision I've had to take on uprating, meaning that in real terms, a typical higher rate taxpayer will be better off next year and no worse off in total by the year after. Mr. Speaker, today we've helped working people, but I do not want to distract from the tough economic situation we face in the world. The public know there are no miracle cures, just the hard work of dealing with our deficit and ensuring Britain wins the global race. That work is underway. The deficit is down. Borrowing is down. Jobs are being created. It is a hard road, but we are making progress. And everything we do, we are helping those who want to work hard and get on. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, today after 2.5 years, we can see and people can feel in the country the true scale of this government's economic failure. Our economy this year is contracting. The Chancellor has confirmed government borrowing is revised up this year, next year and every year. The national deficit is not rising, is rising, it is not falling. The national debt is... I'll say it again. Our economy is contracting this year. Government borrowing and the deficit is revised up this year, next year and every year, and the national debt is rising, it is not falling. And it is people already struggling to make ends meet, middle and lower income families and pensioners who are paying the price, while millionaires get a tax cut, a £3 billion welfare handout to the people who need it least, Mr. Speaker. Let me spell out the full facts for the House, Mr. Speaker. They should listen, they might learn something, Mr. Speaker. In June 2010, the Office for Budget Responsibility forecast our economy would grow by 2.8% this year. In March of this year, they said there would still be growth, but they revised it down to just 0.8%. Today we learn the Chancellor has not even managed that. Growth has not only been downgraded yet again, but he's confirmed, following the double-dip recession, that our economy is now forecast to actually contract inside this year by 0.1%. To contract. Let me remind the House what the Chancellor promised over 2 years ago in the June budget. He said, "We have provided the foundations for economic recovery in all parts of our nation." He said, we have set the course for a balanced budget and falling national debt by the end of this Parliament. And he said, the richest paying the most vulnerable protected. That was the promise, Mr. Speaker. But far from securing our recovery, our economy has flatlined since the spending review in 2010. Over the last 2 years, the Chancellor was expecting 4.6% growth. He's actually achieved 0.6% growth, compared to 1.7% in France, to 3.6% in Germany, and to 4.1% in America, falling behind in the global race, Mr. Speaker. And what we learned today is that growth has been downgraded this year, next year, the year after, and the year after that too, Mr. Speaker. The longest double-dip recession since the Second World War, now followed by the slowest recovery in the last 100 years. And the result of this stagnation, rising long-term unemployment, long-term damage to our economy, falling behind now as other countries move ahead, is that the Chancellor's fiscal strategy has been completely derailed, Mr. Speaker. The defining purpose of the government, the cornerstone of the coalition, the one test they set themselves to balance the books and get the debt falling by 2015, is now in tatters, Mr. Speaker. What we've learned today is that government borrowing has been revised up this year, next year, and the year after that. We now know that compared to the Chancellor's forecast 2 years ago, borrowing is now forecast to be well above the £150 billion of extra borrowing that he was forecasting in March. And they should listen to this. The Chancellor has confirmed that the Prime Minister's pledge to balance the books in 2015 is not met in 2015, it's not met in 2016, and it's not met in 2017 either. The fact is there is more borrowing this year, next year, and the year after, Mr. Speaker. Now, I have to say, we will look in detail when we get the figures, because it was very disappointing, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor failed to give us the cash figures adjusted for borrowing this year, next year, and the year after. The unusual thing is that just a few weeks ago, the independent forecasters were saying that borrowing would be £6 billion higher this year. We will examine the detail of those figures to see whether there has been any dodgy dealing, Mr. Speaker. We will find out in the coming hours. I don't know, Mr. Speaker. I don't know because I've not seen the figures. But what I do know is there is more borrowing this year, more borrowing next year, and more borrowing the year after. And the result of that is that the OBR now shows more borrowing and higher deficits means higher national debt, Mr. Speaker. The national debt, the Prime Minister should listen to this. It might be rather shocking to find out. National debt is going to be higher at the end of this Parliament than the level inherited. It's going to be higher at the end of this Parliament than forecasts in the plans he inherited, and it's no longer falling as a percentage of GDP in 2015. It's rising in 2015, and it's rising again in 2016 too, breaking the fiscal rule for falling debt upon which this Chancellor said his entire credibility depended. In last year's budget, Mr. Speaker, in last year's budget, the Chancellor said, our deficit reduction plan is on course. We will not waver. On course, not wavering. He's not wavering, he's drowning, Mr. Speaker. And now, Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor's now trying to claim. He's now trying to claim his failure on growth and his failure on borrowing and the debt, breaking his own fiscal rule. He's trying to claim it's not his fault, that no one could have foreseen it. What nonsense, Mr. Speaker. Because he was warned, Mr. Speaker. He was warned that a tough medium-term plan to cut the deficit, tax rises, spending cuts, pay restraint that every country had to put in place could only work if the government first put in place a plan for jobs and growth. He was warned it was a huge gamble to go too far too fast and rely on exports to bail him out. He was warned there was a hurricane brewing in the Eurozone and that was not the time to rip out the foundations of the house here in Britain. Once again, the Chancellor is trying to blame high oil prices and the Eurozone crisis for negative growth this year. But it affected all countries, Mr. Speaker. It affected all countries. So why over the last...
Order, I apologise for interrupting. Members must calm themselves. Mr. Biles, I thought you were normally a model of restraint and civility. Good heavens, man, I don't know what's come over you. Calm yourself. Take a pill if necessary, but keep calm. Take up yoga. It's red balls.
Growth down, borrowing up, debt up. They don't like it, Mr. Speaker, do they? They don't like it at all. Why? Once again, the Chancellor is trying to blame high oil prices and the Eurozone crisis. So let me ask him, why over the last 2 years has Britain grown by...
Hello and welcome to the Telegraph's coverage of the autumn statement in 2012. I'm Samant Bhatia and with me are two of the most loquacious and lucid Telegraph commentators we could get our hands on. First of all, we've got the Deputy Editor of the Telegraph, Ben Brogan, and the Group Head of Business, Damian Reece. Gentlemen, what did you make of what the Chancellor just said?
There was a lot in there to chew on. It was very much, as we discussed earlier, a steady-as-she-goes operation. He needed to explain that the reason we're in such deep economic mess was not his fault, so he did a lot of blaming others. He blamed the previous government, he blamed the Europeans, he blamed market forces. And then he had to explain what he was going to do about it. And he came up with a few interesting ideas. There was a very handy giveaway for Tory backbenchers on cancelling the planned rise in fuel duty. There was a incredibly useful for business cut in corporation tax to 21%. And there was some useful raising of the tax thresholds, which the Lib Dems will be grateful for. So it was kind of a mixed bag, but there was some useful work done today.
I guess we were told it was fiscally neutral, Damian, though.
Yes, well, this is it. I mean, let's not forget the economics are as dire as everyone was expecting. So growth is falling, debt is going up as a proportion of GDP, and the deficit is going to take longer to get under control. So it's a pretty appalling backdrop, as we know. But given all of that, it was a reasonable performance. I think it re-established George Osborne as a reasonably competent Chancellor, which will help him, obviously. And there were some eye-catching measures, as Ben says. Business particularly will be quite pleased with things like the annual investment allowance on small companies, for instance. And, of course, they've also published their gas strategy today, which will involve a lot of extra investment. So there were things that he can hold on to and point to as being quite positive rather than just producing a lot of bad news.
We should congratulate the people of Coventry and Brighton who are now going to get fast broadband. HS2 though going ahead, that's not a vote winner surely though.
Well, George Osborne thinks it is, because for all the people along the route who don't like it, there are lots of people further north in England, from Birmingham onwards, who'll be glad to have a high-speed connection to the capital where a lot of business is done. So I think he reckons that he's still onto a winner for that, and it's all about his narrative of a government that takes difficult decisions on big infrastructure projects. Of course, that means we'd like to see decisions on airports as well and nuclear power stations. The other thing that was striking, we discussed earlier how political this was going to be, and there's quite a lot of politics in this statement, which was interesting. In particular, he's laid a few traps for Labour, particularly around welfare. There's some quite stringent cuts to welfare that he's floated through into this autumn statement quite cleverly. He's going to be limiting the automatic increase in welfare benefits, particularly in workplace benefits, over the next 3 years to 1%, which is less than inflation. So that's going to be quite useful for the Treasury. That's going to raise a lot of money. Labour is going to hate it. But he's also going to be putting a lot of his welfare cuts packages through in the form of legislation, and he's going to be inviting Labour to vote against it. He reckons that voters are going to be very enthusiastic and supportive of anything that cuts down on the welfare bill, and he hopes that Labour will oppose all that and will get punished by the voters at the general election.
I guess other potentially positive news that the coalition was trying to, I suppose, espouse is the fact that we're going to get better growth, the borrowing figures are going to come down. Fantasy or potentially correct? I mean, we're talking about 2% growth, I think, from 2013 onwards, for instance.
Well, yes, I mean, these are figures that the Office for Budget Responsibility produce, and frankly, they are always a bit of a finger in the air, frankly, and they may well come down again in future. There's no doubt about that. But just to go back to Ben's points he was making, I mean, for the coalition, there wasn't a great deal in there for the Lib Dems, was there? They didn't get their wealth tax, did they?
No.
And he's not tinkering with stamp duty, as far as I can tell. So housing doesn't get clobbered, which will be, again, pretty popular. But he seems to have maybe just established his authority a bit over.
This is quite interesting, because we had been teed up to expect some kind of big sop to the Lib Dems on wealth, and we didn't really get it. Of course, people are going through the small print, and already he has cut back, as we expected, on the sort of amount you can stick into your pensions if you're lucky enough to have a lot of money. But there wasn't anything that the Lib Dems could waive. However, what was telling was that his final announcement, I thought, which really is going to be politically useful for Nick Clegg, is that he has increased by further than we expected the threshold at which you start paying tax. And so that is getting very close now to the £10,000 mark, which was a big Lib Dem commitment. And so I think the Lib Dems are going to be able to say that it's thanks to us that a whole lot of people at the bottom end of the income scale have been taken out of tax altogether. And I think Nick Clegg is going to be glad to be able to waive the fact that the 10,000 threshold that he has been talking about is now just a few £100s off.
And employers, of course, won't be able to moan either, because he's reduced corporation tax again, which wasn't expected. So from next year, from 2014, it'll be down to 21%. So by far the most competitive in the G20 for certain.
Yeah, but what's interesting is that we talk about how this is fiscally neutral. In other words, it all evens out. But of course, there are people who are going to end up paying more tax. There's quite a lot of people who are being dragged into the 40p rate of tax because he hasn't uprated the allowances by as much as he could have done. So that means a lot of people on what would be considered fairly middle incomes for professionals are suddenly going to find themselves paying more tax because they're going to be higher rate taxpayers. And that, I think, is something that George Osborne is not going to be boasting about. But equally, it raises quite a bit of cash for the Exchequer, and he needs money at these days.
Has he sort of put a stop as well in for Mr. and Mrs. Angry of Croydon, for instance, by sort of saying that our friends in Switzerland are going to help us claw back some money squirreled away, and he's going to look for tax loopholes, close those down, that sort of thing?
I mean, this was pre-announced, and he's working with the Germans, for instance, and the Americans on a sort of international agreement on these issues to do with, for instance, transfer pricing. So that will hopefully put that whole tax debate into some kind of context and put a bit of a lid on it, so that companies can get on with planning, and Britain doesn't look like it's becoming increasingly anti-business. I mean, this is a budget that will hopefully say to the world, actually, if you come here, you're not going to get clobbered, and we'll sort it out, but we'll sort it out with the rest of the world, as it were, the Germans and the Americans.
There's a great tension going on here. On the one hand, there is great pressure on the government, and in fairness, the Chancellor is ramping up that pressure on tackling tax avoidance of all sorts, and in particular, making sure that the people with the most money, who may be tempted to salt away their earnings in bank regimes like Switzerland, where there is bank secrecy and they can keep it out of the grasp of the taxman, to make sure that they are paying more. Of course, the great French statesman once said that the art of taxation is to pluck the goose without the goose noticing. And of course, Britain is also saying we want to be open and competitive globally. We want to be a place where the wealthiest come to invest, to live, to spend their money. And of course, the more you crack down on tax avoidance, the more you could be seen to send a message to people that actually they need to go somewhere else. Wealth is very mobile, and what you don't want to do is drive the wealthiest away from Britain. So George Osborne, I suspect, is very sensitive to that balancing act between attracting the wealthy to come here and not, while at the same time making sure they pay their fair share.
Just have a look at some of the questions which have come in, I guess, via Facebook and Twitter. Rob Walsh via Facebook has asked, one for Damian, I think, really. Are we heading for a triple dip recession, and should the BOE interest rate be 0%?
No, it shouldn't be 0%, because that, for all sorts of technical reasons, would really screw the economy, and Mervyn King has already said there's no chance of it going to 0%. Are we heading for triple dip? Still, I'd say probably 70-30, the chances of that happening. So probably not, but there is still a reasonable chance. And next year, I would have thought we'll probably get away with maybe 1% growth, which is less than the OBR is suggesting. This year, the OBR is obviously forecasting a minus 0.1% economic outturn. I think they may come in as actually slightly on the conservative side. I think we may see a little bit of positive growth this year, so probably not, but there's a chance.
We should flag up that the Treasury for a while were quite nervous about the numbers for this quarter, the fourth quarter of this year, after the increase in GDP in the third quarter, which was thanks in part to the Olympics. They suddenly a few weeks ago, they started getting quite nervous about Q4 and thinking that might be a possibility where they might dip again, hence the triple dip. But the numbers over the coming years are perhaps more optimistic. But Damian's absolutely right. The problem is that the track record of the OBR in terms of predicting outcomes is still in its infancy, and I think we should aim off for them.
We discussed this a bit earlier before the Chancellor's speech, and he was saying, I guess we got the message that it's not my fault, it's not mea culpa, and he mentioned a lot of that. Do you think he's right? Do you think he put a good case across?
George Osborne, he's got on his side, he can argue with conviction that he inherited a huge mess from the previous government. There's a big debate to be had the extent to which the last government was entirely responsible or only partly responsible for the fact that we are in a deep financial hole. But the fact is that the previous government bears a considerable degree of responsibility. Where George Osborne is open to the charge that he bears some responsibility for the fact that nothing has improved, there is a critique that says he hasn't done enough to encourage growth, and the Labour critique is that he has cut too much and those cuts have inhibited growth. He would answer, well, if he hadn't cut what he's already cut and is planning to cut, then the levels of debt and the deficit would be even greater than they are already. I think Damian was right earlier that the numbers are terrible, and the numbers that George Osborne read out should make us all really feel slightly sick to our stomachs. He's predicting that even by 2018, which is in 5-6 years' time, the debt to GDP ratio will still be nearly 80%, which is whackingly huge for a major industrialized nation, and really makes you think that how long is it going to take before we start getting that ratio down at all, and when will we ever reach the point where we might start reducing the debt stock?
So one thing that did help Osborne today was the OBR saying this mess we're in is not the fault of fiscal policy, it is the fault of other issues, so he can always point to that independent assessment of what he's been doing.
Damian Reece, Ben Brogan, thanks very much for joining us today. And that's all from today. I'd like to thank Ben and Damian yet again. And you can follow all the reaction to Mr Osborne's speech on telegraph.co.uk. And this live stream will soon be replaced by highlights of the speech. We'll also republish the studio discussion so you can catch up on it later. Thanks once again for watching.